Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Philippe is currently professor at the Collège de France. He is the director of the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale and also director of studies at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, social science. And he has a number of well-known publications to his name, beginning with his monograph on the Hachois, La Nature Domestique, which was translated by CUP as, it's in the Society of Nature, isn't it? Yeah. And then he wrote in fact, while he was here for that year, he wrote a book translated as The Spears of Twilight. And he's written many other things since, and most recently he tells me he's finished his blockbuster manuscript, which is the comparative study of the social relations of nature. So, Philippe, welcome, and over to you. Philippe is going to talk to us on towards an ontology of socialities. Thank you, Philippe.
Thank you, Steve. Well, it's the third time, in fact, in almost 25 years that I have the opportunity to present a paper at the Friday seminar. And it is always with great intellectual profit and pleasure that I do so. On the two previous occasions, my papers dealt with ethnographic problems that were specific to the lowlands of South America, which is my field of geographical specialization. As you will have gathered from the bizarre title I gave for this paper, this will not be the case today.
I thought not.
My purpose will be anthropological in the broad sense of the term rather than ethnographic, although what I will propound is fueled by a lot of ethnography written by others. As some of you probably know, I've been criticizing in the past 2 decades, along with a few others, the manner in which the Great Western divide between nature and society has been implemented in anthropology, and the ethnocentric flows that have resulted from this projection of an ontological dualism upon non-modern societies. However, if criticism is useful, it is not sufficient. It is not enough to show that the opposition between the universality of natural laws and the randomness of cultural diversity is meaningless for many societies. It is not enough to show that it appears lately, this distinction, in the evolution of Western thought and only becomes fully operational at the end of the 19th century. It is also necessary to integrate this distinction in a new and wider analytical framework where, far from constituting the template that allows anthropologists and historians to gauge distant cultures, it would be nothing more than one of the possible expressions of more general schemas structuring the objectification of things in the world. In other words, it's time to stop flogging a dead horse and to look for a new vehicle with which anthropology could escape from its present leisurely exploration of singularities and proceed ahead with its former project. It is the sketch of this new vehicle which I would like to present in this paper. An absurdly sketchy sketch, I'm afraid. It's so brief period of time, but enough of it, I hope, to give you at least an idea of what I am aiming at. My point of departure is a sort of thought experiment. based on a simple intuition that I borrow from Husserl. The idea that we, humans, are equipped to deal with the world with two basic assets, a body and an intentionality. This equipment allows us to generate a specific kind of integrative schema, which I call an identification. That is the elementary mechanism by the means of which I recognize differences and similarities between I and the object in the world by inferring analogies and distinctions of appearances, behaviors, attributes between what I think I am and what I think the others are. In other words, I can attribute or deny to an as yet indeterminate alter. In this case, it would be more correct to say an allude, to distinguish Latin between a determined alter as the term of a relation between where the other term is specified, and an allude as an indeterminate alter. Then to attribute or deny to an allude an interiority and physicality analogous to the ones I believe I am endowed with. Interiority, as I take it here in a very vague and perhaps deliberately vague sense, according to the context, will refer to the attributes ordinarily associated with the soul, the mind, consciousness, intentionality, subjectivity, reflexivity, the aptitude to dream or to signify, or to more abstract characteristics such as the idea that I share with an allude the same essence or origin, or that we belong to the same ontological category. Physicality, by contrast, refers to form, substance, physiological, perceptual, sensory-motor, and proprioceptive processes, or even temperament, as an expression of the purported influence of bodily humors. Whatever the diversity of the conceptions of the person that anthropologists have encountered and studied, the very high diversity, it seems that this duality of physicality and interiority is universally present, although with an infinite variety, of course, of modalities of connection and interactions between the two spheres or the two planes. There is no case that I know of before the modern materialist theories of consciousness, Dennett, for instance, or Damasio, and so on, of a conception of the ordinary living human person which would be based on a pure interiority, let's call it a mind without a body in our own jargon, or on pure physicality, a body without a mind. The distinction then between interiority and physicality, I believe, is not the simple ethnocentric projection of an opposition between body and mind that would be specific to the West. One should rather apprehend this opposition as it emerged in Europe, and the philosophical and theological theories which were elaborated upon it as local variants of a more general system of elementary contrasts that can be studied comparatively. For the identification based on the combination of interiority and physicality are in fact very limited. When confronted with an allude, whether human or non-human, I can either surmise that this object possesses elements of materiality and interiority analogous to mine, and this I call totemism, or that his interiority and his physicality are entirely distinct from mind, and this I call analogism. Or that we have similar interiorities and different materialities, and this I call animism. Or that our interiorities are discontinuous and our materialities continuous, and this I call naturalism. These formulae define four major types of ontologies, that is, systems of distribution of properties among existing objects in the world, which in turn provide anchoring points for socio-cosmic forms of aggregation, conceptions of alterity, and definitions of the epistemic subject. Let's examine some properties of these four ontologies. Animism, as a continuity of souls and a discontinuity of bodies, is quite common in South and North America, in Siberia, and in some parts of Southeast Asia, where people endow plants and animals with subjectivity and establish with these entities all sorts of personal relations, friendship, of exchange, of seduction, of hostility, etc. In these anemic systems, humans and non-humans are conceived as possessing the same type of interiority. Most animals and some plants are treated as persons endowed with a soul which allow them to communicate with humans. And it is because of this common internal essence or faculty that non-humans are said to possess social characteristics, collective behaviors based on the respect of kinship rules, of ethical codes, ritual activity, etc., etc. However, the reference shared by most beings in the world is humanity as a general condition, not man as a species. In other words, humans and all the kinds of non-humans have each different physicalities, in that their identical internal faculties, essences, etc., are lodged in different types of bodies that are often described locally as clothings that can be donned or discarded, the better to underline the autonomy of these clothings or physicality from the interiorities which inhabit them. Now, as Eduardo Viveros de Castro rightly pointed out, these specific clothings induce contrasted perspectives on the world, in that the physiological and perceptual constraints proper to a type of body impose to each class of being a specific position and point of view in the general ecology of relations. Human and non-human persons thus have an integrally cultural view of their life sphere, because they share the same kind of interiority, but the world that all these entities apprehend is different, for their bodily equipment are distinct. For these differences of bodies bear on form rather than substance. This is hardly surprising, as anemic ontologies probably borrow part of their operational schema from the model of the trophic chain. In Amazonia, in subarctic North America, in the circumpolar area, or in some pockets of Southeast Asia, one finds the same idea that vitality, energy, and fecundity constantly circulate between organisms thanks to the capture, the exchange, and the consuming of flesh. So that this constant recycling of tissues and fluids at all levels of the cosmic banquet, analogous to the one which characterizes nutritional interdependence in the synecological process, helps to understand why all these beings who ingest one another cannot be distinguished by the substances from which they are made. And this is why in anemic systems, dietary prescriptions and proscriptions are less designed to favor or to prevent the mixture of reputedly heterogeneous substances, as is the case, for instance, in Chinese or Galenic medicine, than to favor or to prevent the transfer from the prescribed or the proscribed species of certain anatomical features, not substances but anatomical features, or of certain traits of behavior that are reputedly derived from these anatomical features. By contrast, the place that each being occupies in the trophic chain is precisely determined by its organic equipment, since this organic equipment conditions both the milieu accessible to the species and through the organs of locomotion and of acquisition of food, the type of resources that can be tapped in this milieu. So that the form of bodies is much more than the simple physical conformation. It is the entire biological toolkit that allows the species to occupy a certain habitat and to lead there the type of distinctive life through which it is identified. Although many species share the same interiority, each one of them possesses its own physicality under the guise of a particular ethogram. And because of its specific ethogram, each species has then its own Umwelt in the sense of Jacob von Uexküll. That is, the salient features of its environment are those that are geared to its specific bodily tools, modes of locomotion, modes of reproduction, modes of acquiring food, and so on and so forth. This is why metamorphosis is so important in anemic systems, of course. It is what allows interiority, or what allows, in fact, interaction on a common ground when animals and plants reveal their interiority under a human form in order to communicate with humans, in dreams generally, or when humans, generally shamans or ritual specialists, don animal clothing in order to visit animal communities. Thus, metamorphosis is not an unveiling of the humanity of animal persons or a way to disguise the humanity of human persons, but the culminating stage of a relation where everyone, by modifying the position of observation to which he has been confined by his or her original physicality, strives to coincide with the point of view according to which he thinks, she thinks, that the other term of the relation apprehends himself, herself, itself, etc. So the human will not see an animal as he perceives it normally, but as the animal perceives himself as a human, and the human is seen as he does not perceive himself ordinarily, but as he wishes to be perceived, as an animal. It is then an anamorphosis rather than a metamorphosis. Let us now turn to a second type of ontology, where beings in the world share certain physiological and moral properties that seem to cut across the boundaries of species. I call it totemism, in a very different sense, of course, from that which has been attached to the term since Lévi-Strauss attempted to debunk the totemic illusion by showing it can be viewed as a general classificatory device using natural discontinuities as a mental model to organize social segmentation. This was the accepted meaning which I myself used previously in a couple of papers where I tried mistakenly as it were, to contrast animism and totemism by stating that while totemism uses discontinuities between natural species in order to map social categories, animism uses social categories in order to map social relations between humans and natural objects. And as Tim Ingold and Viveros de Castro rightly objected, these two neat inversion in fact ratified the distinction between nature and society, which is inherent to the Lévi-Straussian interpretation of totemism, and thus does not render justice to animism, where this distinction is meaningless. I now believe that this distinction is also meaningless in the case of totemism, a point of view which, in fact, Lévi-Strauss paradoxically endorses too. Not in Le Totémisme aujourd'hui, of course, but in La Pensée Sauvage, where he writes by a reference to the totemic system of the Menominee and the Chippewa, the Great Lakes, that in this case, each totemic group has to be taken in itself, and I quote Lévi-Strauss, as it tends to form a system, not anymore with the other totemic groups, but with certain differential properties conceived as hereditary. And he adds a few paragraphs further on. Thus, instead of two images, one social, one natural, which is the famous schema in the totémisme aujourd'hui, what we'll obtain is a unique but fragmented social natural image. Social natural image. In that sense, totemism then is more than a universal classificatory device, as Lévi-Strauss argued in the totémisme aujourd'hui. It is also, and perhaps foremost, a very original ontology, which is best exemplified, of course, by Aboriginal Australia. There, the main totem of a group of humans, most often an animal or a plant, not always, but very often an animal or a plant, and all the beings, human and non-humans, that are affiliated to it, are said to share certain general attributes of form, substance, and behavior by virtue of a common origin localized in space. Now, as Carl Georg von Brandenstein showed very clearly in his thorough analysis of the meaning of Australian totem terms, these attributes are not derived from what is improperly called the eponym entity, since the word designating the totem in many cases is not the name of a species, but rather the name of an abstract property which is present in this species as well as in all the beings subsumed under this entity in a totemic grouping. For instance, the Noongar of Southwest Australia had two totemic moieties, respectively called Marnech, that can be translated as the catcher, and Warda, which means the watcher. And these two terms are also being used to designate the two totems of these moieties, the white cockatoo Cacatois temuirostris and the crow Corvus coronoides. In other words, the names of totemic classes are terms that denote properties which are also used to designate the totemic species and not the reverse. That is, names of zoological taxa from which are inferred the typical attributes of the totemic classes. It is thus difficult to maintain, at least for Australia, the classificatory interpretation of totemism, since the basic difference here is between aggregates of attributes that are common to humans and non-humans within classes designated by abstract terms, not between animal and vegetal species that would provide, so to say naturally, by their manifest discontinuities of form and behavior, an analogical template that can be used so as to structure social discontinuities. As ontologies, animism and totemism evidence very different formal properties. In animic systems, the continuity of relations between humans and non-humans, that is allowed by their common interiority, overrides the physical difference between the terms. This explains both the relational nature of animic cosmologies and the fact that the contrastive identities of human and non-human persons are defined by the positions they occupy in relation to one another. They are positional identities. By contrast, totemism, in this specific case Australian totemism, is a symmetrical structure characterized by a twofold identity internal to each class, this identity of the human and non-human terms, and identity of relations, whether of origin, of affiliation, of similarity, or simply of inherence to a class. And this twofold identity echoes the twofold ontological identity of interiorities and physicalities. Thus, totemism places on an equal footing interdependent terms and relations. And this has been a motive for puzzlement among anthropologists, and the reason why they've interpreted totemism by favoring either the identity of terms, in the case of Fraser, for instance, and many others, or the analogy of relations, in the case of Boas, Lévi-Strauss, and so on and so forth. The third formula, which I call analogism, perhaps not felicitously, you'll understand why, is based on the fragmentation of all the entities in the world into a multiplicity of essences, forms, and substances separated by minute intervals, sometimes ordered along a graded scale, such as, a very good example is the idea, the topic of the Greek chain of being, which was so common in Europe from the Middle Ages until the Renaissance. This disposition allows for a recombination of the systems of initial contrasts into a dense network of analogies linking the intrinsic properties of each separate entity present in the world. What is most striking in such systems is, in fact, the amount of ingenuousness with which all the similitudes and resonances liable to provide the basis for inferences are actively sought out or sought for, especially as, of course, they are applied in crucial domains of life, such as divination, the treatment of illness and misfortune, astrology, etc., etc. So the obsession with analogy, with analogies, becomes a dominating feature, such as in China, for instance, where I quote Marcel Granet, who says, who writes, "Society, man, the world are objects of a global knowledge constituted by the sole use of analogy." However, this is important, analogy is here only, in my opinion at least, a result or a consequence. Analogy becomes possible and thinkable only if the terms that it conjoins are initially distinguished. If the power to detect similarities between things is applied to singularities. Singularities that are, by this process, partially abstracted from their original isolation. So that analogism can be seen as a kind of hermeneutic dream of completeness and totalization, which proceeds from an unsatisfaction or dissatisfaction. Admitting that all the components of the world are separated by tiny discontinuities, such as in the Chinese Guanghu, the 10,000 essences. Analogism entertains the hope of weaving these weakly differentiated elements in a canvas of affinities and attractions which has all the appearances of continuity. So it's a dream of continuity. But here, the ordinary state of the world is indeed a multiplicity of reverberating differences, and resemblance is only the expected means to render this world intelligible and tolerable. This extraordinary multiplication of the elementary pieces of the world, reverberating within each of its parts, including humans, of course, fragmented in numerous components, themselves divided in successive nesting and partially located outside of their bodies. This appears to be a distinctive feature of analogic ontologies and the best clue for identifying them. What Michel Foucault calls the prose of the world in Les mots et les choses appears to me a very good example of this type of ontology, which, apart from the paradigmatic case of China, is also quite common in some parts of Asia, it seems to me in some parts of Western Africa, or in Mexico, or in the Andes. The last formula is ours. This is naturalism. For naturalism is not only the idea that nature exists, that certain entities owe their existence and development to a principle which is extraneous both to chance and to the effects of human will. Very old definition. Starts that later. Naturalism does not qualify only the advent, conventionally situated in the 17th century, of a specific ontological domain, a place of order and necessity, where nothing happens without a cause. Naturalism also implies a counterpart, And this counterpart is a world of artifice and free will, the complexity of which has progressively emerged until it rendered necessary the institution in the course of the 19th century of special sciences that are taught in this building, which were given the task of stabilizing its boundaries and its characteristics, that is, the diversity of expressions of the creativity of humans as producers of science, of norms, and of goods. Now, if one considers naturalism, that is the coexistence, the idea that there is a coexistence between a single unifying nature and a multiplicity of cultures, not as the all-embracing template which allows to objectify any reality, but as one among several others modes of identification, then its contrastive properties appear much more clearly. For instance, naturalism inverts the ontological premises of animism, since instead of claiming an identity of souls and a difference of bodies, it is predicated upon a discontinuity of interiorities and a material continuity. What for us distinguishes humans from non-humans is the mind, the soul, subjectivity, moral conscience, language, and so forth. In the same way as human groups are distinguished from one another by a collective internal disposition that used to be called a Volksgeist, but is more familiar to know under its modern label of culture. On the other hand, we are all aware, especially since Darwin, that the physical dimension of humans locate them within a material continuum where they do not stand out as singularities. And the ontological discrimination, which excludes animal organisms that are biologically very close to us, is a sign of the clear privilege granted in our own mode of identification to criteria based on the expression of our purported interiority, language, self-consciousness, theory of mind, etc., etc., rather than the criteria based on material continuity. Now, each of these four modes of identification comes into public existence under the guise of an ontology, which will favor one of them as the main organizing principle of the regime of things, human and non-human alike. And each particular ontology also prefigures a kind of collective more specifically adequate to the gathering within a common destiny of the types of being that this ontology distinguishes. By collective, it's a concept which I borrow from Bruno Latour, I mean a way of assembling humans and non-humans in a network of specific relations, by contrast with the more classical notion of society, which only applies, strictly speaking, to the subset of human subjects, which are thus detached from the fabrics of the relations that they maintain with the world of non-humans. Since such a segregation has little meaning among most non-modern peoples, one must try to treat on an equal footing the principles which allow both humans and non-humans to aggregate in a common world. In other words, sociality is not a given. It is the product of the process of collecting and assembling that each mode of identification operates. contrarily to a tradition that we share on both sides of the channel, thanks to Durkheim, the property of being social is not what explains, but what must be explained. In order to do this, one must examine, for each mode of identification, the pattern of distribution of beings in collectives. Who or what is assembled with whom or what? In what way and for what purpose? And I'll do it briefly. Very, very briefly. I'll begin with animism. What are the types of collective that animism renders possible? In animism, you'll remember that all the species endowed with an interiority analogous to that of humans are supposed to live within collectives that possess the same type of structures and properties. But these collectives, which are integrally social and cultural in our language, are also distinguished from one another by the fact that their members have different morphologies and behaviors. Each collective is thus equivalent to a sort of tribe species which establishes with other tribe species relations of sociability of the same type than those which are held legitimate within the human collective, which ascribes its internal organization, its system of values, and its mode of life to the collectives of non-human persons with which it interacts. In sum, all the isomorphous collectives of humans and non-humans take as their model a specific human collective. And to dispel the impression of implicit sociocentrism that such a proposition may seem to imply, I would like to underscore that using categories borrowed from the field of relations between humans in order to qualify relations with or among non-humans in no way amounts to a metaphorical projection. This was a critique that, for instance, Tim Ingold made to Maurice David for the cognoscent in a lively debate in American anthropologists. If polyvalent relations between beings are always formulated in the animic regime, in the language of instituted relations between humans and not in the language of relations between non-humans, it is because there are good reasons of a cognitive type, I think, to explain why general schemas of relation applying indifferently in practice to humans and to non-humans are only become representable and liable to be stated by using the usual forms under which these relations are known within the realm of interactions between humans. First, because these relations between humans are immediately available, enacted daily, always marked linguistically, if only by kinship terms. Then because they appear more formalized, since their content is specified by explicit rules of behavior, and because their normativity is confirmed by the forcible repetition of prescribed attitudes. And finally, because their conformity to a rule may be submitted to public scrutiny, and because the differences in their instituted expressions become more manifest by contrast with those that prevail in neighboring societies. And the public discussion of this contrast is something which is quite common everywhere. To sum up, the best expression of the animic collective is the species, but a species in which the point of view of its members and the point of view that members of other species cast upon them intervene in the definition of its attribute and taxonomic boundaries, by contrast, of course, with the conception of the biological species held by modern systematics. I won't expand much on the sociological formula of naturalism, since it is the one which is most familiar to us, which we've been teaching for many years, and that we deem, wrongly as it is, to be universal. Humans are distributed within collectives, differentiated by their languages, beliefs, institutions, whatsoever, what we call cultures, which exclude non-humans, that is, nature, artifacts. And the paradigm of collectives is, of course, human society, by contrast with an anomic nature. Everything which is not natural is social. You will notice that if animism and naturalism both take human society as general models for their collectives, they do it very differently. In the case of animism, one can say in a conventional anthropological language that nature draws its specifications from culture, since the majority of beings in the world reputedly live in a cultural regime, and it is only through physical attributes, morphology of bodies, and the behavior associated with this morphology, that collectives are distinguished from one another. In naturalism, by contrast, common anthropological wisdom has it that culture is specified through its difference from nature. It is qualified by default. And although both attitudes, naturalist and animic, may appear anthropocentric, it is only naturalism which is really anthropocentric, since non-humans are defined tautologically, and I use the term non-humans precisely, by their lack of humanity, because there's no other words that we can use for this. As for animism, I think it is better to define it as anthropogenic, in that it contents itself from, deriving from humans only what is necessary in order for non-humans to be treated like humans. The question of totemic collective is rather more complex. In that case, humans and non-humans are jointly distributed in collectives that are hybrid, isomorphous, and complementary, that is the totemic classes, by contrast with animism, where humans and non-humans are distributed separately in collectives, which are also isomorphous, the tribe species, but which remain autonomous in relation to one another. So that if the structure and the properties of animic collectives thus undoubtedly derive from those that are ascribed to human collectives, the structure of totemic collectives is defined by the differential gaps between bundles of physical and moral attributes that are denoted by non-humans, in this case totems, while the properties ascribed to the members of these collectives do not proceed directly neither from humans nor from non-humans, but from a prototypical class of predicates which pre-exist its actualization in specific beings. However, one must distinguish here between, on the one hand, the principles of ontological recruitment into totemic collectives, which do not discriminate between humans and non-humans, and on the other hand, the differentiated functions that the diverse sorts of collectives, of totemic collectives, carry out. In Australia, at least, these functions range along a continuum that goes from an instrumentalization of non-humans by humans, in the marriage sections, for instance, where totemic entities are only contrastive indicators, to an instrumentalization of human by non-humans in the totemic class defined by conception, or descent, where the so-called child spirits perpetuate themselves by appropriating the human reproductive process, using the humans to perpetuate themselves, and passing by an intermediate situation where humans intervene as agents of a finality which is both human and non-human, as the humans are the ritual mediators and the beneficiaries of cosmic fertility, and the case is evident in the rituals of multiplication of totemic species. Thus, by contrast with animism and with naturalism, which use human society as the paradigm of collective, totemism operates an original fusion by mixing in hybrid sets humans and non-humans that use one another in order to produce social linkage, generic identity, and attachment to places. But totemism do so by fragmenting the constitutive units so that the properties of each one of them be complementary and their assemblage dependent of the differential gaps that they present. So that such a system is not driven by a classificatory logic, in the sense of Lévi-Strauss, of one Lévi-Strauss at least, nor by sociocentric logic in the sense of Durkheim, but by a principle that may be called cosmogenic, in the same way that animism is anthropogenic, because it borrows from humans the minimum necessary for non-humans to be treated like humans. Totemism is cosmogenic in that it derives from sets of cosmic attributes, that is, which are not referred to a particular biological species, everything that is necessary for humans and non-humans to be included within a single collective. By contrast with animism, totemism, or naturalism, the analogic mode of identification does not express itself in forms of collective that would be entirely specific to it. For in this kind of ontology, the components of the world are so fragmented into a plurality of determinations that the association of these singularities can take many different forms. But in spite of this morphological diversity, however, humans and non-humans always appear as constitutive elements of a wider collective, since it is coextensive with the world. Here, in the analogic regime, cosmos and society are truly indistinguishable, whatever the type of internal segmentation that such a totality requires in order to remain efficient. For although the analogic collective is identical to the cosmos, it is also internally divided by interdependent constitutive units which are structured by a logic of segmentary nesting. Lineages, moieties, castes, design groups of various nature are here prevalent and expand the connections of humans with the other beings from the infra-world to the empyrean world at the same time as they maintain separate and often antagonical the diversified channels through which these connections are established. And without being entirely ignored, what is exterior to the collective becomes literally an outside world, where disorder reigns, sometimes scorned, sometimes feared, sometimes waiting to be aggregated, incorporated into the central core as a new segment in the appropriate place that has been allocated for it beforehand. Good example is the quarter labeled anti in the quadripartite division of the Tawantinsuyu Empire that was where the Amazonian Indians were assigned by the Incas without ever being actually incorporated. Analogic collectives are not necessarily empires or states, and some of them are weak in numbers and ignore political stratification and disparities of wealth. However, they all have in common that their component parts are ordered hierarchically, if only at a mere symbolic level. The hierarchical distinction is often demultiplied within each segment, thus delimiting subsets which are in the same unequal relation one to the other than the encompassing units. And another characteristic of analogic collective is the use in all dimensions of daily life of spatial and temporal symmetries and nested inverted structures, a guarantee that no singularity will remain outside the grid network of analogic connections. Another characteristic, that just in passing, is the use of macro dual divisions like the position between the hot and the cold, or the wet and the dry, which are very efficient dispositions to integrate fragmented systems of atomic elements. To sum up, the analogic collective is unique, divided into hierarchized segments, and in exclusive relation with itself. By contrast with the egalitarian monospecific collective of animism, or the egalitarian also but heterogeneous collectives of totemism that are bound to enter in relation with each other. Thus, the analogic collective is self-sufficient in that it contains all the relations and determinations necessary to its existence and functioning, by contrast with the totemic collective, which is indeed autonomous at the level of its ontological identity, but which requires other collectives of the same type to become functional. For in an analogic collective, the hierarchy of the elementary units is contrastive, that is, defined exclusively by reciprocal positions. Moiety A is only moiety A because there's a moiety B. And it is because of this that the segments do not constitute independent collectives of the same nature than the totemic classes, since the latter draw from themselves, from specific sites, from specific prototypical precursors, beings of dreamtime, the physical and moral foundations of their distinctiveness. So that the segments of an analogic collective are thoroughly heteronomical, in that they only acquire a meaning and a function by reference to the perfectly autonomous totality that they form jointly. And this is why the ideology of such a collective is inevitably functionalism. That is, the idea that each of its constitutive elements contributes in its specific location to the perpetuation of a stable totality. And without making too much of this, one may even wonder if the vogue of functionalism in British anthropology may not have been partly fostered by the fact that British anthropologists devoted a great deal of their time and energy to studying analogy collectives, especially in West Africa or Southeast Asia. Functionalism as a local ideology, thus meeting the expectations of functionalism as a method of description and analysis. By contrast, functionalism was ill-equipped to make some sense of anemic collectives, and this in turn may explain why, in part at least, why British anthropology almost completely ignored until the end of the 60s some regions of the world where animism prevails, such as the South American lowlands or also subarctic Northern America and Siberia, but there were also political reasons perhaps in that case. Just a very few words of conclusion as a sort of comment on the title of my paper. I have no problem with the idea that what we work on as anthropologists is social, since our subject matter are systems of instituted relations. I believe, however, that the forms of aggregation and the types of practice that we call social are not given prerequisites of human action, but result from basic choices. It's a bad, not very appropriate word, but I don't have any other. Basic choices regarding the distribution of ontological attributes to things in the world, which are based partly on some of the objective properties of these things and partly on the dual template, physicality and intentionality, that humans use in order to detect similarities and differences between themselves and these objects. As a consequence of this process, the manners in which the various types of collectives are conceived and the types of interaction that they allow
when you use the word ontology, this is saying quite a lot, particularly as there are only 4, and we've all got to be one of them. And I think that's my first question, is I assume we don't all have to be one of them, in that I see them as overlapping, so that, for instance, if I take my own field work, they are clearly both my area of Northwest Amazonia is very manifestly both totemic and anemic. It also strikes me that I only have to go just downriver to Gachet and other people's work, and you find a wonderful example of analogical thinking where, I mean, we're speaking insider's jargon, but here are people who map every single bit of the house onto every single bit of the garden and vice versa. So, and possibly not coincidentally, these are hierarchical people. So that it seems to me that these 3 are all, they're coexisting, they're not mutually exclusive. That leads me to a problem which is really the specification. I mean, it leads to various questions then, which is that when we call these ontologies, you're suggesting something big, because we need to specify the context. And I wonder whether, and this is a sort of subsidiary question, is that I'm trying to argue that probably I could provide cases amongst Northwest Amazonian groups for contexts in which we see analogical ontology, totemic ontology, and anemic ontology. And I suspect probably, but this is where the cognitive scientists get going, is that if we specify these contexts, there are occasions when I think, but I couldn't prove this, that the guys who I go hunting with, sometimes they say, Stephen, you see that jaguar over there? See the jaguar over there? He's saying, help, 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 this jaguar's coming to kill us. But at other times, they just shoot it dead, and it's just a damn jaguar.
Completely agree, yes.
So that it all depends. So that, I mean, there's a question which goes down to the sort of work that people have been doing. In other words, there are people, you know, the sort of Pascal Boyer and Maurice Bloch and others are really saying, well, we are wired up in the same way underneath. So that poses that again, this question of ontology. That it seems to me a problematic notion, and that's really my point.
All right. I make a clear distinction between what I call the mode of identification and an ontology. An ontology is the perfect realization of a mode of identification. But the modes of identification are, in fact, distributed among every one of us. And even now, even here, although we are immersed in naturalist ontology, in some contexts, as you say, we have reactions, anemic reactions, or totemic reactions, or analogic reactions.
Children's literature.
I mean, some people think that they look in the paper to see what the revolution of Venus or Jupiter, and they think it will have an influence on what they are going to do tomorrow. And in France, apparently 70% of people think or believe that it has an effective influence. Doesn't mean that the 70% of Frenchmen are analogic in that sense. So it's a combination that is present, I think, in every one of us. But the forms of socialization in which you are raised are actualized. One of these as the preferred, the dominant way to perceive things in the world, to operate discontinuities, to select striking elements in the world, what I call schema, and what I borrow from cognitive psychology, what cognitive psychology calls schema, as a matter of fact. And this can be transposed then publicly in an ontology. That is, you have statements, you have myth, you have rituals that all express in one way or another the whole system, what we call the system of belief, that correspond to this type of ontology. But what I used were ideotypical cases, of course. And the most common situation probably is the one that you mentioned, and I perfectly agree with you, that at least for instance in northwest Amazonia you have clearly cases of hybridization between two modes of identification. In other places of Amazonia it's almost entirely anemic. I think the case of Australia also is very neat. There are all other cases, especially in North America, of quite clearly, quite neat totemism in the sense that I expounded. But Australia is in itself an ideotypical case. There are places where the combination is very difficult in the sense that, and this is the case with Melanesia, for instance. Melanesia is a nightmare for me because of the complexity.
That was my next question. But Marilyn is in the audience.
So there are very clear cases of animism, for instance. In the Great Plateau area, around the Mount Bolsavia, the Kaluli, the Kaswa, etc., are extremely anemic, and they are almost Amazonians. In other cases, they are very analogic. But the standard thing is a mixture there. So that's my answer. Yes. So it has of course an influence on the question of the collectives. What I present is a typical case. I mean, the typical forms of collectives, but probably, and I haven't entered into that, you have also mixtures of forms of collectives linked to this. I mean, what I have in mind when I'm thinking about an analogy collective is China, basically, with other cases, I mean, in the Andes. Or you can have a very tiny one. I don't know if you know the monograph by Nathan Wachter on the Chipaya. Well, it's a group of, I think there are 1,700 in the islands of Bolivia, but it's a perfect analogy collective. But in many other cases, yes, there are complexities, but it's. I mean, I think that the basic thing is to make bold proposals and then have to look for what doesn't fit in. Otherwise, if you obsess by singularities, as I said, then you will have to wait a long time in order to make some sense of the world.
Yeah, just a very quick question. Is your classification of these different modes of identification itself naturalistic?
Oh yes, it is, of course. Yes, of course, by all means. You can't escape from your building. Yes, indeed.
David.
My question is perhaps follows on from Stephen's question. I was just wondering about. I very much like your use of this notion of the modes of identification, but I wonder if we need necessarily begin with the sort of systemic, with an assumption that they lead to or are part of a more general systemic and ontological structure. Because it seems, I wonder, do you think it's possible that by privileging the sort of internal consistency of such systems and assuming then from that will flow the rest of the characteristics that you see, by privileging a given mode of identification, you perhaps make it more difficult to cope with the diversity that you mentioned as a notion of hybrid, a mixture of pure essences? Because, of course, one possibility might be just that there's a repertoire of modes of identification that are flexibly picked up and put down, and that, for example, in an area of Mongolia, you can see areas where you have some sort of animistic modes of identification and use through so-called shamanic practices as part of a much more general Buddhist analogical sort of approach, and need either of them be dominant. In fact, as you were saying, such modes of identification are found in all sorts of societies alongside each other. So need we choose or privilege one of them? Couldn't we just say these are repertoires which, with particular historical cultural moments, lead to particular kinds of mixtures of use, a sort of practice oriented? Through the practice of identification, we get the possibility for making systematic descriptions, but that's not the same as starting with a sort of cognitive system which then is mapped out in practice every time.
Yes, I agree. It appears as a repertoire for the people who use them, but for me, I present it as a typology because that's how I worked on it. And to work on a typology, you need criteria to distinguish the different elements that are within this typology and the possibility of passing from one element to the other and the contrasting properties between one type and the other, etc. So in this way, of course, it appears extremely schematic. But I entirely agree with you that these appear as properties, as repertoire properties. The people in Siberia, which you mentioned, is extremely interesting in that respect. Morton Peterson mentioned precisely the distinction between northern Siberia and southern Siberia, using some of the categories that I devised and Leverhulme de Castro also, contrasting anemic northern Siberia to what he called totemic southern Siberia. I agree with the distinction, but I think it's anemic northern Siberia and analogic southern Siberia, with numerous forms of transition also between, and forms of transition also between northern North America and the other side of the Strait of Bering, the Chukchi, for instance. Many elements among the Chukchi. the chukchik, that are very close to what you get on the other side, but also tiny elements that become to change, not least the raising tears. So some areas like this are fascinating because precisely they show the you can choose to treat them as groups of transformation, let's say, in the Lévi-Straussian sense, or perhaps evolution of one formula going or diffusion or whatever. I mean, it's open, but it's intellectually very challenging and easier to deal with than New Guinea. The concentration in New Guinea, precisely.
How do you see that?
Yeah. One of the characteristics of anemic systems is an obsession, from my point of view, with differentiation, differing types of animals and humans, and they're obsessive with it. And I'm wondering how, because we know that they coexist, how they can coexist with these totemic systems, as you rephrased it, where you're mixing the groups. It's not a metaphoric relationship of differentiation as
I'm not
totemism
convinced
you're
by
doing.
the fact that by the fact that there is totemism and not. I think there is analogism. Yes, the totemism. I'm not sure. Not in the Australian sense, for instance. Probably not. Because the question,
We'll debate that later.
I think there are possible combinations and other not. One that comes to mind immediately as a combination, and not to answer your question, but it's a transition from analogism to naturalism, because that's the best minds of the past 2 centuries have been thinking about this, because that's how modernity emerged. And there's a lot of the history of science, the history of philosophy is replete with these discussions, and not to say history of institutions and so on, discussion of this transition. And so the combination is possible. I think, as you said, that the combination of animism with standard totemism is much more difficult, except perhaps in some bizarre forms of totemism. Frank Speck wrote a paper many years ago, the beginning of the 20th century, on game totems among the Algonquians. The Penobscot, in fact. The Penobscot had no descent groups, but they had they had local groups which associated with a specific animal that they hunted or fished, either for their subsistence or for trade. And so there was no totemic institution in the standard sense of the term, not like among other Algonquian groups, but there was this very close association between a social group, a territory, and a species. And there was a strong identification with the species, to the point that, as is quite common in the northern Algonquian group, the idea was that the species let the humans use their territory. And you have many elements of animism, of course. Northern Algonquians are animic, standard animic people, but in the way they use this very specific relation to the territory and to a specific species, you have an element of totemism. But you have never, of course, you will never find, I think, the type of precisely differentiation that you have in Australia, because, as you say, you cannot at the same time differentiate between collectives and integrate within a collective humans and non-humans. So you have to choose. So they are compromised, as in the case of the Penobscot, not real issues.
Well, after Amazonia, Siberia, Morton.
just talking about whether it's called analogical or totemic, I still think there's one about the Southern Siberian range, where you exactly don't have the imperial kind of thing, but more like a caste-like distribution of them, as Karen described, buried people. But anyway, what I wanted to ask with this idea of the exterior, you know, the exterior to the collective, because in your presentation, it seemed that it was only vis-a-vis the analogical mode, as it were, the analogical and so on, that you talked about the exterior, you know, but it seems to me that to all of them there must be an exterior, and that the exterior to each ontology must in itself be a very interesting phenomenon to look at. For example, in the animist case, clearly there are all sorts of things that are not actually very interesting to kind of mesomorph or anamorph into. There are all sorts of things that are just there, singularities or whatever. So, and there must be different exteriors, as it were, to each ontology, and that must in itself create like an interesting, you know, venue of research.
Mm-hmm. In the case of animism, all the collectives interact. So in fact, there's very little exterior. There is an exterior much further on. A good case would be the central, the Kampash and Inca, and so on and so on. Where there's a collection of collectives which is on the foothill of the Andes, and there's an exterior, and a barbarian exterior, and a threatening exterior, which are the people who come from the Andes, and the bad spirits also, and the sorcerers, and everything which is negative comes from it. This is the exterior, but the main realm of interaction is within this sphere of likewise collectives. In the case of totemism, collectives are the interesting thing and the complex things to think about totemism is that ontologically it's unique, but it cannot function as a unique thing. So it has to have other collective, and these collectives can add. And the case of Australia is interesting precisely because the connections, especially now with the disruption of colonial history and the aggregations of totemic classes which do not correspond to a standard tribe or whatever. People in some cases speak different languages and so on, but they manage to organize themselves because they belong to different things. So there's no real exterior in that sense to the collectives, I mean to the collection of collectives also. And if there's an exterior to the analogic collectives, precisely because it's so drawn towards itself, that the exterior the exterior can have different status. It can be ignored, I will say, it can be feared, it can be... I came the other day under a definition of the Chinese Empire, which I found beautiful. It's everything under the sky. The name of the empire. No, it's a nutshell, no? Everything under the sky.
Oh, right. I thought it was incredibly interesting. As I was coming up to Cambridge, I was reading this incredibly interesting book about sperm whales, which is this kind of monument to kind of methodological wonder and kind of studying something that's possibly difficult to study. And then you get to chapter 7 towards the end of it, which is entitled Sperm Whale Cultures. And it turns out to be the most tediously uninteresting discussion about whether sperm whales are cultures. And you think, but as I was reading, I thought naturalism is in trouble. You know,
I don't think so.
Oh, you don't think so? Okay, that's the comment. But the question is really, I mean, this might be unfair, but I just kind of had this slight hint that underlying these four ontologies might be historical progression. You know, it seemed to be strangely similar to Morgan and then to kind of Marx's notions of social level, or not sufficiently distinguished from that. And I wondered if that isn't a problem, that one of them is in an asymmetrical relation with the other, and that's naturalism, because naturalism is a product of modernity, and modernity is an event, can only be thought of as a historical event, whereas it would be more symmetrical to think of analogism, totemism, and animism symmetrically in Latour's sense as events.
Now I know that's a problem I have. That's a But I'll answer first to the question of naturalism because I think it's a good point. We are, as this book tells us, now submerged by the notions that precisely chimps of culture. I mean, there was a paper in Man at the time, was Man, I think. By the famous paper by Magru and Tuzin, not Tuzin, Tutin, in the 80s on chimpanzee culture, advocating an ethnography of chimpanzee culture with the idea sperm whales and so on and so forth. But what is if you take this both in behavioral ethology or in the field of ethics, environmental ethics or animal rights and so on and so forth, most of the time the criteria that is used to grant either rights or culture, etc., to non-human animals is precisely what they have in common with us, not in terms of physicality, but in terms of interiority. I mean, because they have, yes, they have a theory of mind, yes, they have meta representations, yes, they have whatever, and so they can belong to the club. But this does not dispel the idea that the basic characteristic of naturalism is that. It's only a tendency to introduce new members in the club. The other thing, yes, is a thing that troubles me, but I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer. But I don't see any other case where there was a public ontology, let's say, that was so clearly naturalistic elsewhere. So one may wonder why it took so long to emerge in that form. And the problem, of course, that it's unique. It's unique in the sense that it emerged in some place and then dispersed. But you could say also that the ideal typical totemism is unique in the sense of Australia being unique also, with other forms that are only that are much less clear than Australia. But as I say, I think of this as a typology. It's more a heuristical device in order to try to think differently about all these things we've been thinking for a long time, and to displace the angle of analysis of things. Rather, I'm not obsessed by clinging to these categories. I'm not obsessed by the idea of introducing new categories. But if you can change the perception that we have of relationship between elements in the world, the way they coalesce, the way they organize their interactions and so on, maybe it's a progress. I would have many things to add, but I would spare you. In particular, I think that these modes of identifications also define a certain type of subject, not the universal naturalistic subject. Each one of them and an epistemic point of view. Marx said humanity only suppose that it asks itself the question that it is able to ask. And I think it's quite true. If you have to add to this that humanity, that some portions of humanity have wondered about have asked different questions, and other portions of humanity, hearing the answers, thought that these were answers to their own questions. And of course, it's a lot of cultural misunderstandings as so I think that because of these different ways of perceiving aggregates in the world, the questions are different, and we shouldn't mistake the questions that other people ask for the question that we ask ourselves and answer by our own answers to different questions. And I think all this perhaps may lead to posing different questions. But I think it's more a propedeutic exercise. I don't want to push my word.
Ludwig.
Thank you very much for the paper. I enjoyed it very much. And what I wanted to ask you about is, well, after one question, we appreciated that all the account is in fact part of naturalistic ontology, which is beyond discussion in a way, and otherwise you won't be able to talk about hybridity because it implies something that is hybridized afterwards and so on. And then following Stephen's question, you actually described these four ontologies as not being exclusive, but you said that they are present in every one of us. But the question of course
Not
is
the ontology, the modes of identification.
the modes of identification. But then of course the question is who us is in the context of talking about whether some
Everybody,
things are
every human.
every human,
Yes.
right? So which corresponds with naturalistic ontology, say distinguishing humans from non-humans, and of course this might become an attribute of mind as opposed to the attribute of the world. So we might end up in this trap and in a way denunciate what you claimed were ontologies into properties of mind instead of the world, in a way. And that follows my question, what we can do to our own ontology when we are trying from its point of view appreciate that it's not exclusive, that there are some other modes, other possible ontologies, and whether it's at all possible in a way, if you know what I mean. Not sure that
I don't like the word mind. Perhaps because my initial training was as a philosopher, I like the idea of starting from this, what I call the thought experiment, no? This idea that the distinction between body and intentionality. I think intentionality is not mind. I think these are, by interiority precisely, I mean this, that there is something which is inside a body and which can be identified by its effects but cannot be seen. And it can be seen now. Precisely, that's one of the things also that in fact contributes to reinforce naturalism, because this interiority now can be seen by IRM, etc. So but this point of departure is you could skip it. In fact, there is the question is whether the results are useful in order to make some sense of ethnography. I've always thought, for instance, that and Lévi-Strauss himself says so, that the 2 or 3 first chapters of the elementary structure of kinship are detachable. I think Lévi-Strauss himself says they are detachable. So it's a thought experiment also. It has no real incidence on the following. So you could take this as the same type of object as the first 3 chapters of the elementary structure of kinship. That said, I think, but I'm still prepared to defend the idea, that this distinction between something that it is inside, that is seen only by its effect, and something which is tangible in the person, both as we all conceive ourselves and as it is conceived everywhere. Yes, I think it's not conceived but acted out everywhere. Yes, I think it's. I'm prepared to stand for that. There's a distinction between the theories of the person and the way people actually experiment their presence in the world. This is to be clear. You can have theories of the person where they are precisely in analogic systems. If you take the Pedro Pitac, it's really worked among very good ethnography, recent ethnography among the Zeltal of Kampuk, 17
schools. If you take seriously Germaine Dieterlin, Dr. Bourgon, and you really, I did it, I've counted, I think it's about 80, if you count the small things, everything. So of course it's a huge multiplicity of things, but this is the but this doesn't prevent a standard dogma of experiencing probably this duality, I think, in spite of all these multiple components of the person.
Marilyn.
Thank you for that. It was, of course, exhilarating, as one might expect. And I think that for you to actually get us off the hook of regarding the nature-culture axis as a kind of baseline to which everything must refer is actually a really helpful move forward. Little niggle at the back of my mind. I wonder if there isn't something of a collusion between the Amazonian fascination between the difference between human and non-human and Western philosophical notions of humanity. Because somehow listening to you speak, I feel rather elevated. I feel we're in the presence of important things. Whereas when I look through my Melanesian eyes and want to say what about gender, somehow I trivialize things. Everybody will groan and say gender. Doesn't carry the resonance of the connections that you've made between Western philosophy of humanism, if you like, and the human-animal distinction. If I could just intrigue you for a moment with the notion of gender, I think actually that many of the operations of objectification that you're talking through is done in Melanesian societies through gender, where the contrast is precisely between sameness, same sex, and opposite sex, because of course difference isn't the opposite of sameness. Difference is already a relation because it already necessitates, as it were, an engagement of different entities. I think you might want to add that to your ontological compasses.
Yes, thank you, Marilyn. I think we have had this part of this discussion for especially some years ago in Micas comparing Amazonia and Melanesia. And I think that perhaps precisely one of the reasons of my puzzlement with Melanesia is the fact that gender is used there as a tool, a very specific tool, which is used differently elsewhere, or not used, or little used at least. And this, as you say, introduces complexity. Yes, a great deal of complexity. I entirely agree. Yes. It's one of, I mean, there are different. If I believe more or less what I say, which is the case, I think that then it has possibilities. And among the several possibilities, precisely, there was this aspect that I wanted to explore, that is gender relations, and perhaps kinship also, in a technical sense. And another one, perhaps, which I'm going to explore in the next years, because it's something which is rather new to me, and then I like to discover new things. It's the ways of figuration, of depiction, corresponding to this full modes of identification. The impression that they correspond to four very different modes of depiction. So that's one of the things. It's in that sense that I find it personally practical, because it helps me to think in different ways of organizing very different things, very different sectors or spheres of human activity. But I think gender, yes, would be the central aspect. Thank you, Marilyn.
Andrew.
Melanesia has been mentioned, so I'm probably here. I went to a place known for its study of minds,
You'll have to speak up.
Yes.
I worked in a place known for its totally whites. At the same time, they employ analogical practices. In fact, the moieties, the totem moieties and the ritual moieties are conceptualized as a pair of brothers. And in fact, the concept of totems themselves are also conceptualized of an elder brother and a younger brother. But leaving that aside, just to contextualize what I'm saying, I want to come from a complete inversion of what your conclusion is about. Because you said that sociality is not a given. But to suggest otherwise, that sociality is a given. And that comes from the opening remarks you started from. You began with order and randomness. Questions about necessity and contingency that has sort of sustained itself right towards the end. And my question comes from this animation that you described. The question is about how does one explain this transformation of substance into form and form into substance? Is there a necessary cause that enables this transition? Because what I suspect you have given us, to say that the sociality is not a given, is to take an epistemological view of sociality. But what I'm trying to suggest is to give us an epistemological view, an ontological view of sociality, to try to explain the ontology of the sociality of sociality.
Yes, I would agree. Perhaps I express myself, it's a question of language also. I mean, the things like the social, for instance, has little meaning in English, although it's le social in French. The substantification of concepts that we are so fond of doing in France is not as common in English. That is why I use sociality. Sociality may be understood as a capacity, a property, a predicate. And when I mean that that social is not first, is what is. I want to. My idea is to be critical, not perhaps so much of anthropology, but perhaps of sociology. Right? Not necessarily Durkheim, because we all love to Durkheim. But the more recent sociology, which which has come into common knowledge and use, that there must be a social explanation for everything. I don't think there must be a social explanation for everything. There are explanations for everything, but it's not necessarily social in the sense that it's divorced from something else, which would not be social. So in that sense, everything is social, but they're not specific social explanations. And this is why, perhaps in a provocative manner, I started with the idea that these modes of identification, which are in fact not social because they stem from this thought experiment where there is only, and to borrow another Husserlian concept, it's an anti-predicative experience in the sense that it's before the existence of a given subject. The subject is not constituted in this experience where it distributes properties. It's anti-predicative. This subject is not social in that sense, and this is the reason why I started from ontology in that sense, phenomenological ontology, towards sociology. But of course, it doesn't mean that there's nothing social, because everything is social in that sense. But it's only a way to point to the fact that we should be aware of not trying to find social explanations everywhere. Especially because society precisely asks us and sociologists to find sociological explanations to everything. I don't know if it's...
Philippe, you've done wonderfully. We have just one more question, if you could and then we can all go for our beer. Over to you, Lynn.
Yes, I enjoyed very much the lecture, and I learned a lot of things. But really connecting with what you've just said about the ontological phenomenology, and you cited Husserl at the beginning. I had problems with that in the sense that you mentioned that Husserl tells us about a given body and a given international intentionality. And I would say that maybe it would be better to think of those as precursors and not as givens.
As
precursors.
Preconditions, and maybe not as givens. You know, that are brought forth or developed culturally through ontology. I think that's a better way of, positioning everything in its proper process of how it comes to be. Because I found also your approach of ontology very ontological, if you don't mind my saying this. Couldn't we think, I'm just trying to figure out a different way of thinking of ontologies as kinds of reflexivities that build up meaningful environments through action, for action, and further representation. And this connects with your former question about practices and social practices. Because I feel for that you reintroduce very later on the concept of action and social practices when these ontologies kind of take place locally, culturally, in ethnographic diversity. But it's not there at the beginning. And I think that, as you mentioned, this concept of unworked, and following even Gibson's ecology of perception and the use of the term affordances that he takes from unworked, you can see this can lead to a way of introducing action from the very beginning.
No, I understand, but I disagree. I disagree with Gibson in particular. I think it's very interesting. Yeah, the theory of the ecology of visual perception is a remarkably interesting book, and it has inspired also many interesting writings. But the problem I have with, in particular with the book, and also with phenomenology in general, both Husserl and Proust, even Merleau-Ponty, whom I have a great like, is precisely that phenomenology or affordances, or the theory of inaction of Varela, etc., do not give you the way to understand the stabilizations of forms. And this is this that we need to understand, the stabilizations of forms, because we are dealing at a certain moment with stabilized forms. And these stabilized forms are perpetuated, at least for a while, by dispositions, by institutions and things like that. It's not a constant flow. And this is my problem. This is why I've introduced these frameworks of stabilization, because I think that in somewhere in his book, Gibson says that I believe that with by developing the theory of the ecology of visual perception, the notion of affordance, etc., we'll end up by showing that there is no such thing as the mind, the spirit, society, and things like that, because it's all a question of in fact, detecting invariance in the light. I don't think so. I think they are stabilizing. I think they are still. No. But this is just to give you an idea precisely, and this is why. I also, in a way, disagree with Tim Ingalls in his book on his synthesis of his last book, precisely. So I don't think you can use either phenomenology or Gibson for our task, and our task to try to put some order in chaos. And there is no basis for these stabilization frameworks in phenomenology. one of the most interesting things is comparing Husserl and Cassirer, for instance, in that respect. Symbolic forms, and the problem of symbolic forms is precisely they preclude the type of phenomenological approach, although trying to foster it that Husserl advocated. And at the same time, Husserl, apart from very general conditions, was never able to provide this, and tragically in a way, especially in his crisis. So.
But do you think that action is that close to phenomenology? I mean, I'm not defending here phenomenology, neither Gibson at all, but just a side comment. My main question was, where is action in your whole framework of stabilizing, as you say, frameworks of stabilization? That's what you call ontologies.
But I don't think you have to take action as a result of something. Action is something that is done. That's it. That's all. These modes of identification, when they coalesce into an ontology, let's say, they coalesce in fact into a schema, and a schema is an embodied schema, is a way that's something which is incorporated through childhood, through experiences, and which will lead someone to react in a certain way to a certain circumstance, which will lead someone to see something at some time and not another thing. This is a schema, and this, in that sense, is not constraining action or not necessarily fostering action. It's part of action. The very good example is perspective. I mean, perspective is both a schema that can be objectified. There are theories of perspective. We know the history of perspective, but at the same time, it's an interiorized way with which we perceive painted surfaces, and which for us has become so incorporated that we need an effort to actualize it like a schema, and our life is full of these schemas. So action is something that exists. It's not. I don't think it's a good idea to oppose. I know it's done. On the one hand, you have the bad structuralist, and on the other hand, you have agency. I think it's ridiculous. No. But it's a personal comment.
I think we ought to stop because, Philippe, you have done wonderfully. As you know already, that we always take the speaker to the bar for a glass of beer. Seen in the perspectival world of Jaguars, our beer is blood. I thought, seen in analogical terms, it's the British obsession with different kinds of beer. And seen totemically, it's I'm a Carlsberg man. We're just going to give you naturalistic beer. So thank you very much.